Please pretend you're my dad." The words cut through the November rain like a knife, and Scott Jeffrey froze mid-step, his Italian leather shoes ankle-deep in a freezing puddle. He turned to find a little girl, maybe 8 years old, barefoot on the concrete, wearing nothing but a soaked orange t-shirt that clung to her shivering frame. Her hair twisted into small knots decorated with colorful beads, and she clutched a white stuffed unicorn with gold hooves against her chest like it was the only thing keeping her alive. But it was her eyes that stopped Scott's heart, wide, dark, filled with a terror no child should ever know. "Sweetie, where are you?" He was cut off by the little girl. "Please," she whispered again, her small fingers digging into the sleeve of his immaculate blue suit with desperate strength. "Please, I need you to." She couldn't finish her sentence. Movement in the alley shadows made Scott's blood run cold. A man emerged from the darkness, leather jacket slick with rain, metal pipe resting casually across his shoulder, and a smile that belonged on something that hunted in the dark. "Nice try, sweetheart," the man said, his voice carrying the false warmth of a children's show host. "But your real daddy sent me to bring you home." The girl's grip became painful. Her voice cracked as she looked up at Scott with those terrified eyes. "That man killed my mom last night," she whispered, barely audible over the hammering rain. "Please don't let him take me." Scott's corporate instincts screamed at him to walk away, to let someone else handle whatever domestic nightmare this was, to get to his Uber and his penthouse and his bourbon and forget this ever happened. But something in those 8-year-old eyes, pure, primal terror, rooted him to the spot. He stepped forward, positioning himself between the girl and the man with the pipe. "Look at you," the man sneered, eyes traveling over Scott's tailored suit with contempt. "Pretty boy in your fancy threads." He gripped the pipe with both hands now, smile widening. "Better run back to your penthouse before I mess up that fine face and ruin that expensive suit." The pipe swung at Scott's head in a vicious arc. Scott's body moved before his mind could catch up. Muscle memory from a life he'd left behind 15 years ago. Sidestep, grab, twist. The pipe clattered to the wet pavement with a metallic ring that echoed through the alley. The man's eyes went wide with confusion for one beautiful second before Scott's fist connected with his jaw. He dropped like a stone, unconscious before he hit the ground. In the stunned silence that followed, broken only by the relentless rain and the man's unconscious groaning, the little girl whispered into Scott's soaked suit jacket, "He killed my mom. Please don't leave me." What Scott Jeffrey didn't know in that moment, couldn't possibly know, was that the man lying unconscious at his feet was just the beginning. That saying yes to a desperate child's plea would cost him everything he'd spent 15 years building. That by morning, he'd be running for his life through the streets of Chicago with every cop in the city hunting them both. And that the people who wanted this little girl dead would stop at nothing to make sure she never told anyone what she knew. Before we get into that, here's a special shout out to Piper Martinez watching from Australia. Thank you for being one of our amazing supporters and engaging with the channel. A character in the story was named in your honor. If you'd also like to get a shout out in the next video, please like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from, and you'll be given a shout out. Thank you. Now let's get into the story. Scott's hands were shaking as he knelt beside the unconscious man, rain soaking through the knees of his $1,000 suit pants. He pressed 2 fingers against the man's neck, feeling for a pulse, strong and steady. Alive. Thank God. But as Scott's eyes adjusted to the dim light from the street lamp, he saw it. A gold badge clipped to the man's belt, partially hidden beneath the leather jacket. And there, on his hip, a police radio crackling with static and distant voices. "Oh God," Scott breathed, stumbling backward. "He's a cop. I just assaulted a police officer." "He's not a cop," the little girl said quietly, still clutching her unicorn. "He's a murderer who happens to wear a badge." Scott looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. 8 years old, maybe 9, barefoot in November, soaked to the bone. But her eyes held something beyond fear. They held certainty, the kind of certainty that came from witnessing something no child should ever see. "What's your name?" Scott asked, his voice gentler now. "Piper. Piper Johnson." She hugged the unicorn tighter. "My mom was Detective Maria Johnson. Chicago PD, 12 years on the force. 3 weeks ago, she was going through evidence from a big drug raid in Englewood. Cocaine, heroin, fentanyl, millions of dollars worth. She was doing inventory, making sure everything was logged properly before it got destroyed. Okay, Scott said slowly, trying to understand why this mattered. And the numbers didn't match. Piper's voice was remarkably steady for a child in crisis. Mom showed me her notes one night when I couldn't sleep. She had these spreadsheets, what the arrest report said they seized versus what actually made it to the evidence room. Kilos of product just disappearing. Like someone was taking it out and rewriting the paperwork to cover it up. Scott felt something cold settle in his stomach. Your mother thought cops were stealing drugs? Not stealing. Selling. Piper looked down at the unconscious man with pure hatred. That's Henry Hart. He was Mom's partner for 6 years. He came to my birthday parties. He brought me Starburst. She held up the white unicorn. He taught me how to ride a bike. And the whole time, he was selling drugs with a bunch of other cops, and Mom never knew until she started checking those evidence logs. The rain hammered down harder, and Scott pulled Piper deeper into the alley, away from the streetlight. Away from Henry. Your mother discovered police corruption. What happened next? She kept investigating. Quietly. She didn't tell anyone except. Piper's voice cracked. Except Henry. Her partner. The person she trusted most in the world. She told him 2 days ago what she'd found. Scott closed his eyes, already knowing how this story ended. Last night, there was a raid in Austin. Piper continued, her small voice fighting against the storm. Mom's unit responding to reports of armed dealers in an apartment building. She called me at 7 p.m. from the staging area, told me she loved me, told me to do my homework, and she'd be home by midnight. Tears mixed with rain on Piper's face. At 11:30, 2 officers showed up at our door. Said there'd been an accident. Friendly fire during the raid. Mom was hit in the crossfire. She died at the hospital. Jesus, Scott whispered. But I couldn't sleep. I was on the couch when Henry came to the house at 2 in the morning. He thought I was asleep upstairs. I heard him in the kitchen, talking on his phone. Piper's hands trembled around the unicorn. He said, "It's done, Captain. The detective won't be a problem anymore. Yeah, they're calling it friendly fire. Nobody's questioning it." Then he laughed and said, "What about the kid? You want me to handle that too?" The words hit Scott like a physical blow. This wasn't a domestic dispute. This wasn't a custody battle. This was a child who'd witnessed her mother's murder being covered up by the very people sworn to protect the city. That's when I ran, Piper said, grabbed Starburst, and climbed out my bedroom window. I've been hiding all day, in dumpsters, behind buildings, anywhere Henry wouldn't look. Then I saw him in this alley searching for me, and I saw you walking by in your fancy suit, and I thought maybe you were someone who could help. Someone who wasn't part of it. Scott's mind raced through the implications. A corrupt police ring selling confiscated drugs back onto the streets. Evidence tampering on a massive scale. A decorated detective murdered and her death disguised as friendly fire. A child witness they wanted to eliminate. And now him. A corporate lawyer who'd just knocked out a dirty cop and gotten himself tangled in a conspiracy that had already killed once. How do you know all this? Scott asked. About the evidence. The corruption. You're 8 years old. Mom talked to me. Piper's voice was barely audible over the rain. She said I was smart enough to understand important things. She showed me her spreadsheets, explained what she was finding. She said if anything ever happened to her, I needed to remember everything. Every detail. Every name. Piper looked up at him with those dark, knowing eyes. She was preparing me, wasn't she? She knew they might kill her. Scott felt sick. A mother preparing her 8-year-old daughter for her own murder. Making sure the child would be a witness, would remember, would be able to testify. Maria Johnson had known she was walking into danger and had done it anyway, leaving her daughter behind as insurance. As proof. Do you remember the names? Scott asked. The other cops involved? Some. Henry Hart for sure. And someone called the captain. Henry said that name on the phone. Mom had other names in her notes, but they were at home and I couldn't. Piper's voice broke. I ran so fast. I didn't take anything except Starburst. Henry groaned louder. His head lolled to the side, consciousness returning in stages. His fingers twitched, moving toward the radio on his belt with instinctive muscle memory. We need to move, Scott said, grabbing Piper's hand. Right now? If he wakes up and calls for backup. Then they'll all come, Piper finished. And they'll kill you too for helping me. Scott looked down at the little girl whose hand he was holding. A stranger 5 minutes ago. Now the most important person in his life because she'd grabbed his sleeve and asked for help. Because she'd looked at him with terrified eyes and seen someone worth trusting in a world where trust had gotten her mother killed. Henry's eyes fluttered. His hand closed around the radio. In seconds, he'd be awake enough to call it in. To summon every corrupt cop in Chicago to this alley. To finish what he'd started. Scott had maybe 10 seconds to make a choice that would define the rest of his life. Run and protect Piper, becoming a fugitive from a system he'd always trusted. Or stay and try to explain, try to work within that system, and hope, pray, that there were still good cops left who'd believe a corporate lawyer over a decorated officer with 12 years on the force. 10 seconds. Henry's thumb moved toward the radio's transmit button. Piper's hand squeezed Scott's with desperate trust. And Scott Jeffrey made his choice. If a stranger's child grabbed your sleeve and told you someone murdered their parent, would you get involved or walk away? Tell me in the comments what you'd do. Scott's hand shot out and grabbed Piper's arm. We need to go. Now. Henry's radio suddenly crackled to loud life, a dispatcher's voice cutting through the static. All units, we have a 10 to 13 officer needs assistance, South Loop near State and Harrison. Suspect is male, 6 foot, dark hair, business suit. He has a juvenile female with him. Consider armed and dangerous. Run. Scott pulled Piper toward the mouth of the alley as Henry's hand twitched toward his radio. They burst onto the sidewalk and Scott's eyes frantically scanned the street. There, 2 blocks north, his silver BMW still parked where he'd left it 20 minutes ago. 20 minutes that had destroyed his entire life. They ran through the rain, Piper's bare feet slapping against wet concrete, Scott's dress shoes sliding on slick pavement. Behind them, he could hear Henry groaning louder, consciousness returning. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Scott's hands shook as he unlocked the BMW, practically throwing Piper into the back seat before sliding behind the wheel. Buckle up, he said, starting the engine. Hold on tight. He pulled into traffic, heading north toward River North, checking his rearview mirror every 3 seconds. Piper sat silent in the back seat, clutching Starburst, her whole body shivering in her soaked orange t-shirt. Water dripped from her hair onto the leather seats. She looked so small, so terrified. Scott grabbed his phone with one hand, scrolling through contacts while navigating Chicago traffic with the other. He found the name he needed, Marcus Chun, his firm's lead investigator. Former FBI agent, 20 years in federal law enforcement before going private. If anyone could help them, it was Marcus. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. Jeffrey? It's almost 1 in the morning. This better be good. Marcus, I need your help. I'm in serious trouble. What kind of trouble? Marcus's tone shifted immediately, professional and alert. The kind that involves a dead cop, a corrupt police department, and a child witness they want to kill. Scott ran a red light, checking his mirror again. No patrol cars. Yet. I'm coming to your office. I'll explain everything when I get there. But Marcus, I need you to trust me. A little girl's life depends on it. There was a pause. Then, I'll be waiting. Use the back entrance. Scott ended the call and glanced at Piper in the rearview mirror. We're going to see someone who can help us. But first, we need to get you out of those wet clothes. He pulled into a 24-hour Walgreens on State Street, parking under a broken streetlight. Stay here. Lock the doors. I'll be right back. Inside the fluorescent bright store, Scott moved quickly through the aisles, grabbing a girl's sweatshirt, sweatpants, socks, cheap sneakers, and a pack of towels. The cashier, a tired-looking teenager with headphones around his neck, barely glanced at him as Scott paid with cash and hurried back outside. In the parking lot, Scott kept watch while Piper changed in the back seat, using the towels to dry off. She emerged in oversized gray sweatpants and a purple hoodie, looking slightly more human, but still shell-shocked and silent. As Scott helped her tie the sneakers, 3 police cruisers drove past the Walgreens in quick succession, lights off, but moving with purpose. Hunting. We need to keep moving, Scott said quietly. Marcus's office building was a converted warehouse in River North, all exposed brick and industrial windows. Scott pulled into the alley behind it and buzzed the back entrance. The door clicked open immediately. Marcus Chin stood in the doorway, 50 years old, gray hair cut military short, wearing jeans and a CPD sweatshirt from his old life. His sharp eyes took in Scott's ruined suit and Piper's terrified face in 2 seconds flat. Get inside, he said. Quickly, they rode the freight elevator to the third floor in silence. Marcus's office was exactly what Scott expected: cluttered desk, multiple computer monitors, walls covered in case files and photographs. A pot of coffee was already brewing. "Sit," Marcus said, gesturing to chairs. He handed Piper a blanket from a closet, and she wrapped herself in it, still clutching Starburst. "Start from the beginning, Scott. Don't leave anything out." So Scott told him everything. The alley. Henry Hart. Piper's mother discovering the drug evidence discrepancies. The raid in Austin. The friendly fire that wasn't friendly. The phone call Piper overheard at 2 in the morning. Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each detail. When Scott finished, Marcus turned to his computer and started typing. Henry Hart. Marcus muttered, pulling up police databases he shouldn't have access to but somehow did. 15 years on the force. Maria Johnson's partner for 6 years. Decorated officer, multiple commendations. His fingers flew across the keyboard. And here's Maria Johnson's incident report from last night. Shot during a raid in Austin. 3 witnesses say she was moving through a doorway when shots came from behind her position. Behind her, not from the suspects. Piper made a small sound in her throat. Marcus pulled up more files, his face illuminated by the blue glow of multiple screens. Crime scene photos. Evidence logs. Personnel files. He cross-referenced names, dates, locations, his years of FBI training evident and how quickly he connected dots that shouldn't connect. Then he stopped. His face went pale. "Scott," Marcus said quietly, "you need to see this." Scott moved behind the desk, looking over Marcus's shoulder. On the screen were 5 other police officers, different districts, different units, different faces. But they all had one thing in common. These officers all died in the past 3 years, Marcus said, clicking through their files. Officer David Chun, suicide by gunshot. Officer Rachel Morrison, car accident on Lakeshore Drive. Officer James Patterson, home invasion gone wrong. Officer Sarah Kim, accidental overdose. Officer Robert Williams, fell down his apartment stairs. "I don't understand," Scott said. Marcus turned to look at him, and Scott saw something he'd never seen in the former FBI agent's eyes before: fear. "I just cross-referenced their computer activity logs. All 5 of these officers accessed the same evidence database Maria Johnson was investigating in the weeks before their deaths. All 5 of them flagged discrepancies in drug seizure reports." Marcus's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Maria Johnson isn't the first cop who died investigating this corruption. She's the 6th. The room fell silent except for the hum of computers and the distant sound of sirens somewhere in Chicago's night. Scott looked at Piper, huddled in her blanket, clutching a stuffed unicorn given to her by her mother's murderer. And he understood with crystal clarity that they weren't dealing with a few bad cops. They were dealing with something far worse. This story gets darker than you can imagine, and I need you with me for what comes next. If you're invested in Scott and Piper's survival, hit that subscribe button, because part 2 is coming and you won't want to miss where this goes. Marcus's fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced precision, pulling up file after file. 5 faces appeared on the screen, 5 Chicago police officers staring out from their official department photos. 5 people who should still be alive. Officer David Chun, Marcus said, clicking on the first file. 42 years old, 16 years on the force. Found dead in his garage on March 15, 2022. Single gunshot wound to the head. His service weapon was in his hand. Ruled a suicide. Scott leaned closer to the screen. Was it? Chin's wife said he wasn't depressed. Wasn't drinking. Had just bought tickets to take his kids to Disney World that summer. Marcus's jaw tightened. But the case was closed in 48 hours. No investigation. He clicked to the next file. Officer Rachel Morrison, 38, 12 years on the force. Died July 8, 2022, when her car went off Lake Shore Drive at 3 in the morning. No witnesses. Accident reconstruction said she fell asleep at the wheel. "Let me guess," Scott said. "She wasn't tired. She'd just started her shift an hour earlier." Marcus pulled up the accident report. Toxicology was clean. No mechanical failures. But somehow she just drove straight into a barrier at 70 miles per hour. Piper sat motionless in the corner chair, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, Starburst clutched against her chest. Her eyes were fixed on the screen, watching the faces of dead police officers scroll past. Officers who'd made the same mistake her mother had made, discovering the truth. Officer James Patterson, Marcus continued, his voice growing harder. 51 years old, 23 years on the force. November 2022. Home invasion. 3 masked men broke into his house in Bridgeport, shot him during a supposed robbery. Took his wallet and watch. Never caught. Except it wasn't a robbery, Scott said quietly. Patterson lived in one of the safest neighborhoods on the South Side. No break-ins in that area for 5 years before or after his death. And the robbers left behind $10,000 in cash Patterson kept in his bedroom safe. They only took items that made it look like a robbery. Marcus clicked to the 4th file. Officer Sarah Kim, 29 years old, only 5 years on the force. January 2023. Found dead in her apartment from an accidental drug overdose. Heroin and fentanyl. Let me guess, Scott said. She didn't use drugs. Passed every department drug test with flying colors. Her friends and family said she'd never touched drugs in her life. She was training for a marathon. Marcus's voice was cold now. But somehow, a bag of heroin and a syringe just appeared in her apartment, and she decided to shoot up for the first time. The 5th and final face appeared on screen. Officer Robert Williams. 45, 17 years on the force. June 2023. Fell down the stairs in his apartment building and broke his neck. Security footage showed him alone, carrying groceries. Ruled accidental death. But, Scott prompted. But Williams was a former college athlete. Perfect balance, excellent physical condition. And the medical examiner noted the angle of the neck fracture was inconsistent with a fall. More consistent with someone breaking his neck from behind and then staging the scene. Scott felt sick. 6 deaths in 3 years. All ruled accidents or suicide. All closed quickly with minimal investigation. Marcus pulled up another screen. A complex web of data showing computer access logs. And here's the pattern. Every single one of these officers accessed the evidence management system database in the weeks before their death. The same database Maria Johnson was searching. He highlighted specific entries. David Chin flagged discrepancies in a drug seizure from a raid in Englewood. Rachel Morrison noted missing evidence from a case in Austin. James Patterson questioned why quantities in 3 separate busts didn't match arrest reports. Sarah Kim found falsified chain of custody documents. Robert Williams discovered evidence that had been logged and then mysteriously disappeared. They were all investigating the same thing, Scott said. The same corruption ring. Marcus pulled up a spreadsheet. Based on the evidence logs these officers were reviewing, I estimate we're talking about $15 to $20 million in confiscated drugs that were resold back onto the streets over the past 5 years. Cocaine, heroin, fentanyl. High-value product that should have been destroyed but instead went back to the cartels through dirty cops acting as intermediaries. Piper's quiet voice cut through the room. How many? Marcus turned to look at her. How many what, sweetheart? How many police officers are selling drugs? Her voice was hollow, empty. How many people killed my mom? Marcus's expression softened slightly. Based on the operation's scope and the number of districts involved, I'd estimate between 30 and 40 officers. Maybe more. 40 cops, Scott breathed. That's not a few bad apples. That's an organization. It's a machine, Marcus corrected. And look at this. He pulled up another screen showing system access flags. Someone high up in the department has been monitoring who accesses these specific evidence files. There's tracking software embedded in the database that sends alerts whenever anyone searches for certain case numbers or evidence logs. He pointed to Maria Johnson's access history. Your mother searched these files 3 weeks ago, Piper. And 2 days before she died, this alert was generated. A red flag appeared on the screen next to Maria's name. Someone knew she was getting close. Someone was watching. They're always watching, Piper whispered. Scott stared at the screen, understanding crystallizing into cold, hard fury. This wasn't about a few corrupt cops stealing drugs. This was a systematic, organized operation that had murdered 6 police officers and covered up every death. An operation with resources, reach, and the power to manipulate investigations. An operation that knew exactly who was getting too close to the truth and eliminated them before they could talk. Marcus's phone suddenly rang, the sound sharp in the quiet office. He glanced at the screen and his face went white. What? Scott asked. Marcus held up the phone so Scott could see the caller ID. Chicago Police Department. Nobody moved. The phone rang again. And again. Don't answer it, Scott said. I'm not. Marcus set the phone down on the desk, watching it ring. But Scott, if they're calling me, that means they know we're here, Scott finished. The phone stopped ringing. In the sudden silence, they could hear sirens in the distance. Getting closer. Marcus looked at Scott, then at Piper. You need to run. Right now? They're coming. Would you trust the police in this situation, or would you run? Because what Scott decides in the next 60 seconds determines if Piper sees tomorrow. Drop your answer below. We need to go to the FBI, Marcus said, already reaching for his phone. Federal agents, outside jurisdiction, they can protect you both while we build the case. The FBI field office doesn't open until 8 a.m., Scott shot back, checking his watch. That's 6 hours from now. You really think Piper has 6 hours? Marcus hesitated, his hand freezing over the phone. They both knew the answer. Then what do you suggest? Marcus asked. Scott's mind raced. A different precinct. Somewhere Henry Hart doesn't work. Different district, different command structure. We find a desk sergeant, tell them everything, and ask for protective custody until we can get to the FBI in the morning. That's a massive gamble, Marcus said. If the corruption is as widespread as we think, then we're already dead. Scott looked at Piper, still huddled in her blanket. But maybe, just maybe, there are still good cops out there who don't know what's happening. Cops who join to actually protect people. Marcus studied Scott's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. 18th District and near North. Different area from Henry's unit in South Loop. I have a contact there. Never worked with the narcotics division, so he might be clean. He grabbed a laptop and external hard drive, starting to copy files. I'll stay here and compile everything we have into an evidence package for the FBI. You get Piper to safety, then call me once you're in protective custody. Thank you, Marcus. Don't thank me yet. Just keep that little girl alive. Marcus looked at Piper with something like pain in his eyes. She's already lost too much. Scott and Piper took the back stairs down to the alley where the BMW waited. The rain had finally stopped, but the November cold cut through their clothes like knives. Scott started the engine and pulled onto the empty streets, heading north toward the 18th District. For the first few minutes, Piper sat in silence, staring out the window at Chicago passing by. Closed storefronts, occasional taxis, the glowing windows of late-night diners. Then, quietly, she spoke. Last summer, Mom taught me how to ride a bike in Grant Park. Scott glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Yeah, I was scared. All the other kids my age already knew how, but I'd never learned. Mom said it didn't matter what other kids could do. She said everyone learns things at their own pace. Piper's voice was soft, distant, like she was watching the memory play out on the window. She ran beside me for hours, holding the back of the seat. I kept asking if she was still there, and she kept saying, I'm right here, baby. I've got you. She sounds like she was a good mom. She was the best. Piper's reflection in the window showed tears streaming down her face. Then one time I looked back, and she wasn't holding on anymore. I'd been riding by myself for like 50 feet and didn't even know it. I was so mad at her for letting go, but she just laughed and said, you didn't need me anymore. You were already flying. Scott felt something break in his chest. Piper, I promise you, I'm going to keep you safe. I know I'm a stranger, and I know I'm not your mom, but I promise I will not let them hurt you. Why? Piper asked, looking at him in the mirror. Why are you doing this? You don't know me. You could have just walked away. Scott thought about his penthouse, his corner office, his comfortable life built on contracts and mergers, and carefully avoiding anything messy or complicated. He thought about the moment Piper grabbed his sleeve and looked up at him with those terrified eyes. Because you asked me to, he said simply. And because it's the right thing to do. They pulled up to the 18th District Station at 3 a.m. The building was newer than Scott expected, glass and steel, well lit, with the Chicago Police Department emblem prominent above the entrance. It looked safe, official, like a place where justice actually happened. Scott took Piper's hand as they walked through the doors. The interior was harsh with fluorescent lighting after the darkness outside. A few officers moved through the halls, dealing with late-night paperwork and processing. Behind a raised desk at the front, a desk sergeant looked up from his computer. He was maybe 55, with graying hair and tired eyes that had seen too many years of night shifts. But his smile was genuine as he looked at them, a well-dressed man in a ruined suit and a little girl in an oversized purple hoodie, both soaked and exhausted. "How can I help you folks at this hour?" he asked, his voice carrying the rough warmth of a career cop who still cared about people. Scott opened his mouth to explain, to tell him everything about Henry Hart and Maria Johnson and the corruption that had killed 6 officers. But before he could speak, he felt Piper's entire body go rigid beside him. Her hand crushed his fingers with desperate strength, and her breath came in short, panicked gasps. "Piper." Scott knelt down, concerned. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" Piper stared at the desk sergeant with the same terror Scott had seen in the alley when Henry Hart emerged from the shadows. Her voice came out in a whisper so quiet Scott almost didn't hear it. "That's him," she breathed. "That's the captain." Time seemed to stop. Scott's blood turned to ice. He looked up at the desk sergeant. The tired eyes, the genuine smile, the grandfatherly appearance of a cop who'd spent 30 years serving his city. The man who'd ordered Maria Johnson's execution. The man who'd built an empire selling drugs back onto Chicago streets. The mastermind behind 6 murders disguised as accidents and suicides. The captain's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied them, and Scott saw the exact moment recognition flashed across his face. The moment he realized he was looking at the corporate lawyer and the dead detective's daughter who should have been in Henry Hart's custody hours ago. The smile never left the captain's face, but something cold and lethal appeared in his eyes. "Well now," the captain said slowly, his voice still warm but with an edge underneath like a razor hidden in honey. "This is interesting. Why don't you both come around to the side door here, and we'll have a nice private conversation about whatever brought you to my station in the middle of the night." His hand moved slowly towards something under the desk, a button, an alarm, a weapon. Scott couldn't tell. Scott just walked Piper straight into the lion's den. "What would you do right now? Try to talk your way out? Or run? Comment your survival strategy." Scott's mind raced, but his body remained calm. He couldn't let the captain see panic. Couldn't let him know that Piper had just identified him as the man who ordered her mother's death. "Actually," Scott said, forcing his voice to stay casual, "I think we might have the wrong station. We're just looking for directions to." "Directions?" The captain's smile didn't waver, but his hand continued its slow movement towards something beneath the desk. "At 3 in the morning? With a little girl who looks terrified? Why don't you tell me what's really going on here, friend?" Scott took a step backward, pulling Piper with him. "We're fine, actually. Wrong place. We'll just—" "I don't think so." The captain's voice lost all warmth. His hand found what it was searching for, a radio. "See, I just got a very interesting call about 20 minutes ago. About a corporate lawyer and a little girl who might be in the area. And you two match the description perfectly." Other officers in the station were starting to notice now. A female cop near the coffee machine set down her mug. A younger officer at a desk stopped typing. All eyes were turning toward the front desk. "Scott," Piper whispered, her voice shaking. "We need to go? Now." The captain lifted his radio to his mouth, eyes locked on Scott. "This is Sergeant Morrison at the 18th. I have them. Send backup too." Scott didn't let him finish. He grabbed Piper's hand and ran. They burst through the precinct doors and into the cold night air. Behind them, the captain's voice boomed through the station. "Stop them. Don't let them leave." Scott's BMW was parked 30 feet away. They sprinted toward it, Piper's new sneakers slapping against pavement, Scott's dress, shoes still somehow on his feet despite everything. He unlocked the car with shaking hands, threw Piper into the passenger seat this time, and started the engine. Tires screamed as he pulled away from the curb. In his rearview mirror, Scott saw the captain emerge onto the sidewalk, radio pressed to his ear, speaking with cold precision. Other officers were running to their patrol cars. "Buckle up," Scott said, making a hard right onto a side street. "Hold on tight." He drove like he'd never driven before, running red lights, weaving through the minimal late-night traffic, taking turns that made the BMW's tires protest. Piper sat rigid in her seat, both hands gripping starburst, her eyes wide and fixed on the side mirror where flashing red and blue lights were beginning to appear behind them. Scott's phone started ringing. Unknown number. He ignored it. It rang again. Different unknown number. Then again. And again. 7 calls in the first minute. 8. 9. His phone was lighting up like a Christmas tree with incoming calls from numbers he'd never seen before. They're tracking the phone, Scott said, making a decision. He rolled down the window and threw it out onto Lakeshore Drive, watching it bounce and shatter on the pavement. No more phones. No more GPS. He drove south, away from the police presence concentrating in near north, weaving through neighborhoods until he found what he needed. A Jewel-Osco parking lot in Bridgeport, empty except for a few employee cars at 4 a.m. Scott parked the BMW behind the dumpsters at the far end of the lot, out of sight from the street. Out, he said to Piper. We're switching cars. Switching to what? Piper asked. Scott scanned the parking lot. There, an old Honda Civic, maybe 15 years old, parked in the employee section. He approached it, looking around to make sure no one was watching, then smashed the driver's side window with his elbow. The car alarm didn't go off. Either it was broken or never installed. Small blessings. Get in, Scott said, brushing glass off the seat. His hands found the ignition wires under the steering column. Another skill from his past life, before law school, when he'd grown up in a neighborhood where knowing how to hotwire a car was sometimes necessary. His fingers worked quickly, stripping wires, connecting the right ones. The engine turned over. That's illegal, Piper said quietly from the passenger seat. Scott looked at her and laughed. A short, harsh sound. Piper, I've assaulted a police officer, fled from custody, and I'm harboring a witness to a murder conspiracy. I think grand theft auto is pretty low on my list of legal problems right now. They drove to a Target in Hyde Park, one of the few stores open 24 hours. Scott grabbed a baseball cap and sunglasses from the men's section, paying cash at the self-checkout. Then he found the electronics section and bought 2 prepaid phones with cash, along with some prepaid minutes cards. No ID required. No way to trace them. Piper stood beside him, silent and trembling, still clutching Starburst. She looked so small in the harsh fluorescent lighting. So young. Just a little girl who should be home in bed, not running for her life through Chicago at 4 a.m. because the people sworn to protect her wanted her dead. Back in the stolen Honda, parked in a dark corner of the Target lot, Scott activated one of the prepaid phones. His hands were shaking now, adrenaline finally wearing off, reality crashing down on him like a physical weight. He had just run from the police. The actual police. Had broken into a car and stolen it. Had destroyed evidence of his whereabouts. Had made himself a fugitive. For a child he'd met 3 hours ago. His entire life, his career, his reputation, his future, was over. Done. Finished. Scott pulled up his work contacts on the burner phone, having memorized the important numbers years ago. He found his managing partner's number and dialed. It rang once, twice, 3 times, then went to voicemail. James, it's Scott Jeffrey. His voice was steady, calm, like he was leaving a message about rescheduling a meeting. I'm sorry, but I need to resign from the firm effective immediately. I can't come back. I won't be coming back. Ever. There's something I have to do. Something more important than any case we've ever worked on. I hope you understand. And I'm sorry for any inconvenience this causes. He ended the call and sat in the darkness, staring at the phone in his hand. 15 years of his life. 15 years of 80-hour weeks, of building a reputation, of climbing from nothing to partner track at one of Chicago's most prestigious firms. All of it gone in a single night because a little girl grabbed his sleeve and asked for help. Scott looked at Piper beside him. She was watching him with those dark eyes, understanding more than any 8-year-old should have to understand. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm sorry I ruined your life. You didn't ruin anything, Scott said, and he meant it. I made a choice, and I'd make it again. Scott just sacrificed everything, his career, his home, his entire future, for a child he met 3 hours ago. That's the kind of person we need more of in this world. If this story is hitting you emotionally, subscribe and be part of a community that believes in doing the right thing even when it costs everything. The sun rose over Chicago at 6:47 a.m., painting Lake Michigan in shades of pink and gold. Scott watched it from the parking lot of a Bank of America on the south side. Baseball cap pulled low, sunglasses hiding his face even though it was barely dawn. He withdrew the maximum amount from the ATM, $800, knowing it would flag his account, but not caring anymore. His account, his life, his identity, all of it was already burned. He hit 4 more ATMs over the next 2 hours, moving from neighborhood to neighborhood. Chase in Bronzeville, Wells Fargo in Hyde Park, Citibank in Bridgeport. U.S. Bank in Pilsen. By 9 a.m., he had $4,000 in cash stuffed in his suit pockets. It wouldn't last long, but it was enough to keep them moving. Piper sat in the passenger seat of the stolen Honda, silent and small, watching Chicago wake up around them. Workers heading to jobs, kids walking to school with backpacks. Normal people living normal lives while she ran from the people who'd killed her mother. "You need to eat," Scott said, pulling into a 24-hour McDonald's in Pilsen. "When did you last have food?" Piper thought about it. "Yesterday morning. Before school. That's almost 24 hours ago." Scott parked and they went inside, ordering at the counter, chicken nuggets, fries, orange juice, apple slices. The cashier barely looked at them. Just another tired man and a kid getting breakfast. They sat in a booth in the back corner, away from windows. Piper picked up a chicken nugget with shaking hands, stared at it for a long moment, then took a small bite. Then another. Then she was eating like she hadn't seen food in days, which wasn't far from the truth. Scott's attention was drawn to the TV mounted in the corner. The morning news was on, volume low but captions running across the bottom. Then his own face filled the screen. His official firm photo, expensive suit, confident smile, the picture of success. Next to it, Piper's school photo from last year, her hair in the same twisted knots, but her smile bright and real. The caption read, "Manhunt for lawyer who abducted child." Scott's blood ran cold as he read the scrolling text. Corporate attorney Scott Jeffrey, 38, wanted in connection with the abduction of Piper Johnson, 8. Jeffrey allegedly took the child from her guardian, Officer Henry Hart, during a custody dispute. Hart was injured in the altercation and hospitalized. Jeffrey considered armed and dangerous. Child may be in extreme danger. If you see them, do not approach. Call 911 immediately. "They're saying you kidnapped me," Piper whispered, staring at the screen. "They're lying." Scott felt rage burning through his exhaustion. "They're making me look like the criminal while they hunt you. Will people believe it?" Scott looked at the other customers in the McDonald's. A woman with 2 kids. An elderly man reading a newspaper. A construction worker grabbing coffee. Would they believe the news? Would they see a dangerous kidnapper and an endangered child? Or would they see what was really happening? "We need to keep moving," Scott said. "Finish your food. Quickly." They spent the next 8 hours moving from location to location, never staying more than 2 hours anywhere. Starbucks in Chinatown, where Scott bought them coffee and hot chocolate, sitting in the back corner while Piper colored on napkins with crayons a barista gave her. The public library in Bronzeville, where they sat in the children's section and Piper read picture books, while Scott researched FBI field offices and witness protection programs on a public computer. Washington Park in the afternoon, sitting on a bench watching people jog and walk dogs, trying to look like a normal father and daughter out for fresh air instead of fugitives running for their lives. The sun was setting over the park, turning the sky orange and purple, when Piper finally spoke about something other than their immediate survival. "Do you have kids?" she asked quietly. "No," Scott said. "Never been married. Was always too busy with work." "You'd be a good dad." The words hit Scott harder than he expected. "What makes you say that? You're still here." Piper looked up at him with those dark eyes that had seen too much. "You could have left. Could have turned me over to them. Could have saved yourself. But you didn't. That's what good dads do. They stay even when it's hard." Scott felt something break and reform in his chest. "Your mom taught you that. She showed me that. Every day." Piper hugged Starburst tighter. "That's what she did. She stayed even when it was hard." "Tell me about the unicorn," Scott said. "What's its name?" For the first time in hours, Piper almost smiled. "Starburst. Mom gave her to me when I was 5. She said I was their little star who burst into their lives and made everything brighter. She said even on the darkest nights, stars still shine, and I should remember that." "She was right," Scott said. "You are pretty bright." "I don't feel bright right now. I feel scared." "Me too," Scott admitted. "But we're going to get through this. I promise." As darkness fell over Chicago, Scott drove them to a parking garage off Roosevelt Road, the same one Marcus had mentioned in passing as having minimal security cameras. They descended 3 levels underground, found a corner spot behind a concrete pillar, and parked the Honda. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting strange shadows. "We'll stay here tonight," Scott said. "It's hidden, quiet, safe as anywhere." Piper nodded, already climbing into the back seat and curling up with Starburst. Scott gave her his suit jacket as a blanket. It was ruined anyway, covered in rain and dirt and the debris of a life left behind. Scott. Piper's voice was soft, sleepy. Thank you for staying. Always, Scott said, and meant it. He watched as Piper's breathing slowed, her small body finally relaxing for the first time since her mother died. Her face smoothed out in sleep, looking peaceful, looking like the child she should be instead of the witness to murder she'd been forced to become. One hand stayed wrapped around Starburst, the other tucked under her cheek. Scott sat in the driver's seat, exhausted beyond words, and thought maybe, just maybe, they'd make it through this. The FBI field office opened in 3 hours. They just had to survive until morning. Just had to make it through one more night. He watched Piper sleep and felt something he hadn't felt in his entire corporate career. Purpose. Scott went from corporate lawyer to fugitive father figure in 24 hours. Do you think he made the right choice protecting Piper? Or should he have turned her over and saved himself? Real talk in the comments. Scott sat in the driver's seat at 11 p.m., watching shadows shift across the concrete walls of the parking garage. Exhaustion pulled at every muscle in his body, begging him to close his eyes, but his mind wouldn't stop racing, couldn't stop planning, calculating, searching for a way out that didn't end with Piper in a body bag. Milwaukee was 3 hours north. He could drive through the night, ditch the Honda at a bus station, buy tickets with cash to somewhere random. Minneapolis maybe, or Kansas City, someplace far from Chicago where the captain's reach couldn't find them. Maybe Piper had relatives, grandparents, aunts, uncles, people who could take her in while Scott figured out how to get the evidence to someone who actually cared about justice. The prepaid phone sat in the cup holder, screen dark. Scott had texted Marcus hours ago with the new number, but gotten no response. That worried him. Marcus should have replied. Unless. The phone buzzed. Scott grabbed it, hoping for Marcus's name. Instead, he saw only an unknown number and a message that made his blood turn to ice. The girl dies tonight. You can't protect her forever. His hand shot toward the back seat, reaching for Piper's shoulder to wake her. They needed to move. Now. Right now. But before his fingers touched her, a sound echoed through the parking garage. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. Sirens. Scott's head snapped toward the entrance ramp 1 level above them. Red and blue lights began strobing against the concrete walls, growing brighter. Then more lights appeared at the exit ramp on the other side. They were coming from both directions, boxing them in. No, Scott whispered. No, no, no. He turned the ignition, the Honda's engine sputtering to life. But even as he shifted into reverse, more lights appeared. A third set at the pedestrian entrance. A fourth at the vehicle exit on their level. They'd blocked every way out with professional tactical precision, moving multiple units into position simultaneously. Scott's mind raced. How? How did they find us? He ditched his phone, ditched the BMW, used only cash, stayed off cameras, made no calls except to Marcus on the burner. Unless. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The ATMs. 5 different ATMs across the south side in a specific pattern. They'd tracked his withdrawals, analyzed the pattern, predicted where he'd go. Or maybe it was the stolen Honda. Someone reported it, ran the plates, flagged it in their system. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe they'd just been watching every parking garage in a 10-block radius of where they'd last been spotted, waiting patiently like hunters at a watering hole. Scott. Piper's voice was groggy, confused. Then she saw the lights. Scott, what's? Get down. Scott pushed her below the window line. Stay down and don't move. But it was too late. Officers were already moving in formation. At least 8 that Scott could see, maybe more in the shadows. Black tactical gear, weapons drawn, movements coordinated like a machine. They approached from multiple angles, cutting off any escape route Scott might have considered. Flashlights swept through the garage, searching, getting closer. Piper started hyperventilating in the back seat, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. They found us. They found us. They're going to kill me like they killed Mom. I won't let them, Scott said, though he had no idea how he'd keep that promise. The tactical team was 50 feet away now. 40 feet. Scott could see their faces behind the flashlights. Young officers, following orders, probably not even knowing what this was really about. Probably believing they were rescuing an endangered child from a dangerous kidnapper. The perfect cover story. Scott's hand hovered over the gear shift. He could try to ram through them. The Honda was old but solid. If he got lucky, if he aimed for the gap between two patrol cars, maybe. Then he saw him. Through the rear window, standing behind the advancing tactical team with calm authority, was the captain. No tactical gear for him. Just his sergeant's uniform, radio in one hand, the other making precise hand signals directing the operation. And on his face, visible even from this distance in the strobing lights, was a cold smile. The smile of a predator who'd finally cornered his prey. The captain raised his radio to his mouth, and a moment later, a voice boomed through a megaphone, echoing off concrete walls. "Scott Jeffrey, you are surrounded. Turn off the engine and exit the vehicle with your hands visible. Send the girl out first. This is your only warning." Piper was shaking so hard Scott could feel the car vibrating. "He's here. The captain's here. Scott, he's going to." "Shoo." Scott reached back and grabbed her hand, squeezing tight. "I've got you. Remember what your mom said? I'm right here. I've got you." "But Mom's dead," Piper whispered. "I know, baby. I know." Scott's mind raced through impossible options. Surrender, and Piper dies. Run, and they both die. Fight, and they definitely both die. There was no good choice. No winning move. Just different ways to lose. The officers were 20 feet away now. 15 feet. Weapons trained on the Honda. Flashlights blinding. The captain's voice came through the megaphone again, still calm, still controlled. "This is your last chance, counselor. Make the smart choice. Send the girl out." "What do we do?" Piper asked, her voice breaking. "Scott, what do we do?" Scott looked at the officers closing in from the front. The patrol cars blocking the exits. The concrete walls boxing them in on all sides. The captain standing behind it all with his cold smile, waiting to finish what he'd started when he'd ordered Maria Johnson's murder. 3 levels underground in a parking garage off Roosevelt Road. With nowhere left to run and a child's life in his hands, Scott Jeffrey had to make a choice. Surrender to a corrupt system that wanted Piper dead, or find one final desperate move that might give them a chance. The officers were 10 feet away. 5 feet. The captain's smile widened. And Scott made his decision. They're trapped with nowhere to run, and a child who's witnessed too much. What's Scott's move here? Surrender and hope for mercy, or fight and risk everything? Tell me what you'd do. At least 8 officers in tactical formation closed in from multiple angles, their movements synchronized with military precision. Black body armor, helmets with face shields, assault rifles held at the ready. These weren't regular patrol cops. This was a tactical response team, the kind deployed for active shooters and armed standoffs. The kind trained to neutralize threats with extreme prejudice. Flashlights blazed through every window of the Honda, turning the interior into a blinding white prison. Scott raised his hand to shield his eyes, squinting against the glare. Voices shouted commands from all directions, overlapping, creating a wall of sound designed to disorient and overwhelm. "Hands where we can see them. Exit the vehicle. Do it now." Then the captain's voice cut through everything else, amplified by the megaphone, calm and cold as a winter lake. "Scott Jeffrey, you are surrounded. There is no escape. Send the girl out, and this ends peacefully. You have my word, no one needs to get hurt." Piper's grip on Scott's hand became painful, her small nails digging into his palm hard enough to draw blood. Her breath came in short, desperate gasps, the sound of a child on the edge of panic, of complete breakdown. Scott could feel her trembling through the car seats, could hear the whimper she was trying to suppress. "He's lying," she whispered. "He killed Mom. He'll kill me too." "I know," Scott said quietly. The tactical lights were so bright now that Scott couldn't see the officers behind them. Just silhouettes of men with guns, faceless enforcers of a system that had been corrupted from within. How many of them knew what this was really about? How many were good cops following orders, believing they were saving a child from a kidnapper? And how many were part of the captain's machine, ready to put a bullet in an 8-year-old girl the moment she was away from witnesses? Scott's mind drifted for a moment, muscle memory of a different life. His penthouse view of Lake Michigan at sunset, the water turning gold and pink. His corner office on the 40th floor of the glass tower where he'd closed million-dollar deals. Bourbon in crystal glasses. Leather chairs soft as butter. The respect of colleagues. The envy of rivals. 15 years of building a fortress of success around himself, brick by careful brick. Golden Gloves champion at 21. Law school at 23. Associate at a top firm at 26. Junior partner at 32. The American dream, earned through blood and sweat and refusing to quit when everyone said he wasn't good enough, wasn't from the right family, didn't have the right connections. All of it built over 15 years. All of it destroyed in one night because a little girl grabbed his sleeve in a rain-soaked alley. The officers moved closer. 10 feet now. Their weapons were trained on the Honda, fingers near triggers, ready to fire if Scott made any move they interpreted as hostile. 9 feet. 8 feet. The tactical lights never wavered. The captain's voice boomed again. Last chance, counselor. Make this easy on yourself. You're a smart man. You know how this ends if you don't cooperate. Send the girl out. Step out with your hands up. And maybe, you walk away from this with just kidnapping charges instead of dying in a parking garage. 7 feet. 6 feet. Scott could see individual faces now behind the visors. Young men, mostly, doing their jobs, following commands from a superior officer they had no reason not to trust. Scott, Piper whispered, I'm scared. Me too, baby. What do we do? Scott looked at her in the rearview mirror. 8 years old. Orphaned less than 48 hours ago. Terrified out of her mind. Clutching Starburst the unicorn. The last gift from her mother's murderer. The only piece of childhood she had left. Her hair still in those twisted knots with colorful beads. Her oversized purple hoodie making her look even smaller than she was. She'd asked him to pretend to be her dad in that alley. And somewhere over the past 16 hours of running, hiding, surviving together, it had stopped being pretend. Scott didn't have kids. Had never wanted kids. But this child, this brave, terrified, impossibly strong little girl, had become his to protect. His responsibility. His daughter in every way that mattered. And he would die before he let the captain take her. Scott's thumb hovered over his phone. Marcus's contacts still pulled up on the screen. One call. One desperate plea for help. But help was miles away, and the officers were 5 feet from the car now. For feet. A phone call couldn't stop what was about to happen. The captain's voice came through the megaphone one final time. This is over, Jeffrey. You've lost. Be smart. 3 feet away. 2 feet. Weapons raised. Command shouted. Flashlights blinding. The trap closing with mechanical inevitability. Scott looked at Piper one more time. Do you trust me? Yes, she said without hesitation. Then hold on to Starburst and don't let go. No matter what happens next. His hand moved from the phone to the ignition key. Not to turn the car off. Not to surrender. But to make a choice that would either save them both or kill them both. There was no middle ground left. No compromise. No negotiation with people who'd already murdered 6 cops and were planning to make it 7 victims plus one brave little girl. The officers were 1 foot from the car doors. The captain stood behind them, smile fixed on his face, victory in his eyes. Scott Jeffrey, corporate lawyer, former Golden Gloves champion, accidental father to a child not his own, turned the key and made his choice. This is it. The moment where Scott either surrenders Piper to certain death or makes a move that changes everything. What do you think you should do? And more importantly, what would you do? Comments are open. The engine roared to life. The Honda's old motor screamed as Scott slammed the accelerator to the floor. Officers shouted. Weapons snapped up to firing position, muzzle flashes lighting up the parking garage like lightning strikes. Please don't let them take me, Piper whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos. Never, Scott said, and aimed the Honda straight at the narrow gap between 2 patrol cars blocking the exit. Gunfire erupted. The rear window exploded in a shower of glass. Piper screamed, covering her head with Starburst. Scott ducked low, one hand on the wheel, foot never leaving the accelerator. The Honda launched forward like a missile, 70 miles per hour in a concrete box, heading straight for a gap that might be wide enough or might kill them both. Metal screamed against metal. The Honda scraped through with inches to spare, side mirrors ripping off, sparks flying, paint peeling away in strips. But they were through. Up the exit ramp at a dangerous angle, tires squealing, more gunfire from behind, and then a tire exploded. The Honda lurched violently to the right. Scott fought the wheel, barely keeping control as they burst out onto Roosevelt Road. The rim scraped against pavement, throwing sparks, the car limping and broken but still moving. Hold on. Scott ran a red light. horn blaring, a taxi swerving to avoid them by inches. Behind them, sirens screamed to life. Red and blue lights flooded the night. At least 5 patrol cars were in pursuit, maybe more. Scott's mind raced through options. South toward the interstate. No, they'd set up roadblocks. West into the neighborhoods? No, too many dead ends. North toward Lake Michigan. The thought crystallized with desperate clarity. Water. Navy Pier jutting out into the lake. One last impossible gambit. Scott yanked the wheel left, heading east toward the water. The Honda was dying, smoke pouring from the wheel well, engine making sounds no engine should make, the destroyed tire flapping and shredding. But it kept moving, kept carrying them forward. "Scott, what are you doing?" Piper cried from the back seat, tears streaming down her face. "Are we going to die?" "Not today," Scott said, though he had no idea if that was true. His phone rang, Marcus's name on the screen, but Scott couldn't answer. Couldn't take his hands off the wheel for even a second as he weaved through late-night traffic, the disabled Honda barely responding to commands. Behind them, the patrol cars were gaining. Professional pursuit drivers in functioning vehicles versus a corporate lawyer in a stolen car with 3 good tires. Scott made a hard right onto the Navy Pier access road. The pier stretched out into Lake Michigan, dark and deserted at midnight, closed to tourists, empty of everything except the sound of water and wind and approaching sirens. The Honda's engine finally gave up, died completely. Scott coasted on momentum, rolling toward the pier entrance, watching the speedometer drop. 40 miles per hour. 30. 20. The car rolled to a stop 50 feet from the water's edge. Behind them, sirens were approaching from 3 directions, converging on their position with tactical precision. "Out." Scott grabbed Piper's hand, pulled her from the back seat. "Run." They sprinted toward the darkened pier, Piper's sneakers slapping against wood, Scott's dress shoes, somehow still on his feet, providing no traction. The pier stretched ahead of them, jutting into Lake Michigan like an accusing finger. Behind them, the captain's voice boomed through the megaphone. "There's nowhere left to run, Jeffrey. You're only making this worse." But Scott kept running, pulling Piper along, their footsteps echoing off water. The end of the pier appeared ahead, a railing, beyond it nothing but black water and endless darkness. Scott skidded to a stop at the railing. Piper crashed into him, breathing hard, clutching starburst. Behind them, flashlights cut through the night like searchlights. Officers emerged from the darkness. 8, 10, 12 of them, spreading out in a semicircle, weapons drawn, movements coordinated. Professional. Lethal. Scott looked at the water 40 feet below, black as ink, freezing in November, waves chopping against the pier's supports with dull thuds. Then he looked at Piper. She saw where his eyes went. Understanding dawned on her face, followed immediately by terror. "No. Scott, no. I can't swim. I never learned. Mom was going to teach me next summer, but..." "It's over, Jeffrey." The captain's voice, closer now, no megaphone needed. Scott could see him walking through the line of officers, that same cold smile on his face. "Step away from the girl. Last chance. There's nowhere left to go." Officers moved closer. 20 feet away. 15 feet. Weapons trained on Scott's chest. Flashlights blinding. The captain's hand raised, ready to signal his men to take the shot. Scott looked at Piper. 8 years old, terrified, brave, clinging to a stuffed unicorn and the last shreds of childhood. He thought about what the captain would do to her, how she'd disappear into the system, how there'd be an accident, a tragedy, a dead witness who could never testify about corruption and murder. He thought about Maria Johnson teaching her daughter to ride a bike in Grant Park. "I'm right here, baby. I've got you." Scott lifted Piper in his arms. She wrapped her arms around his neck, buried her face in his shoulder, her small body shaking with sobs. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Me too." Scott held her tighter. "But I've got you. I promise." Officers 10 feet away. The captain's voice. "Don't be stupid, Jeffrey. Put the girl down." Scott backed up to the railing, felt the metal bar press against his legs, looked down at the black water waiting below. "Trust me," he whispered to Piper. Then Scott Jeffrey, corporate lawyer, Golden Gloves champion, fugitive, accidental father, stepped backward off Navy Pier into darkness. They fell through the freezing November air. Piper's scream cut off as they hit the water. The impact was like hitting concrete. Cold exploded through Scott's body, stealing his breath, His thoughts, everything except the desperate need to hold onto Piper. They plunged beneath the surface, black water closing over their heads, the world above disappearing into muffled chaos. Scott kicked hard, fighting toward the surface, Piper deadweight in his arms. His lungs screamed. His clothes dragged him down. But he kept kicking, kept fighting, kept holding on to the child he'd promised to protect. Above them, on Navy Pier, officers reached the railing and flashlights swept the dark water. The captain stared down at the black waves, searching for bodies, for survivors, for proof that this nightmare was finally over. The flashlight beams found something floating on the surface where they'd gone under. A white stuffed unicorn with gold hooves and a rainbow tail, bobbing in the waves. Nothing else. Just ripples spreading outward into endless darkness. Scott just jumped off Navy Pier into Lake Michigan in November with a child who can't swim and at least a dozen armed cops hunting them. Part 2 is going to be insane, and you need to be subscribed because this story is far from over. Hit that button right now. Scott and Piper's survival depends on you seeing what happens next. Don't let them down.